Welcome back. Last time we talked about evidence from astronomy for the age of the universe, and I mentioned that young Earth believers have two ways of responding to the evidence of age of the universe and of the Earth. And I said the first one of these is creation science. Let me try to explain this to you for a moment. Most likely you're familiar with this if you belong to some kind of a conservative church. When I talk about creation science, I'm talking about the kind of science that is done by a group like the Institution for Creation Research, or the Creation Research Society, or Answers in Genesis. And there are other organizations like this. These organizations include thousands of sincere and intelligent people, many with scientific degrees, some with advanced degrees in the relevant sciences like geology, for example, who are trying to show that mainstream science is just wrong about the age of the universe. Now, how do they do this? Well, there are certain types of arguments. One is simply to say that the mainstream scientists have just misread the evidence, that they've just gotten confused. And so, for example, the argument may be that if you look carefully at evidence of radiometric decay, you find out that it's not as constant as most scientists think that it is, and therefore it's not a good gauge to the age of things. Another way that young Earth scientists argue is to say that mainstream science is wrong because it has rebelled against the authority of the Bible. If scientists would just look at what the Bible says, and of course to the young Earth creationists it's very clear that the Bible says that the Earth is young, if they would believe that and then go out and look at the world, they would see things differently from the way they do when they're coming with their more evolutionistic assumptions. And another view that is, another perspective that is taken is that perhaps the laws of nature have actually changed. Maybe during the creation week or during the flood year, the laws of nature were just different. Maybe light did travel faster back then, so that when we look at stars that appear to be billions of years away, we are seeing light that comes from those stars, but they're not, and they are that far away, but the light's not been traveling that long because light used to travel more quickly. Or maybe radiometric decay took place at a much higher rate during the year of the Noachic flood. Or maybe tectonic processes took place very, very rapidly then. Right now, the tectonic plates of Earth's surface move in relation to one another at something like a ½ inch to an inch a year in many cases. Maybe during the year of the flood, they move thousands of miles, and that's why the continents have separated and so forth. So they will try to use these ideas of scientists just misreading the evidence or not coming to nature with the proper frame of mind based upon the scriptures, or the idea that maybe the laws of nature have changed. Now, what do you make of this, and how do you assess their efforts? Here it actually gets complicated because a lot of the discussions get technical very quickly, and those of us who are not up to speed in some of these technical areas may find it difficult to follow. Nevertheless, I want to say to you that if you really want to get to the bottom of this to your heart's own satisfaction, if you're someone with curiosity about these things and you don't want to take somebody else's say-so, then I think the way you have to do it is to take one or two specific areas of controversy, look at these in great detail. So let's say, for example, you take radioactive decay. You read about mainstream views of radiometric dating. You understand them. You read long enough to get it and understand what they're saying. Then you look at critiques that come from the young Earth people. There's a critique of this called Thousands Not Billions, Challenging an Icon of Evolution, Questioning the Age of the Earth by Dr. Don DeYoung. And this is based upon the work of a group of young Earth scientists. They call themselves the RATE group. They have tried to show that in fact radiometric dating is not very accurate, and they also propose that maybe during the year of the Noah's flood, maybe the laws of nature were simply different. Well, you read this, and then you go back and you read critiques of this from the mainstream scientific point of view. You can find these in Davis Young's book that I talked about earlier, his book on geology. You can find them online at the website of the American Scientific Affiliation. And then you may need to read critiques of the critiques written by the young Earth folks. You almost have to do this if you want to come to a place where you really are confident where you stand. And I encourage you to do that. I don't encourage you to simply take my view of these things, but I will give you my view for what it's worth. I think that young earth science is a lost cause. I think this really for three reasons. One, I personally just don't find the arguments very persuasive. I'm not a scientist. I don't think my opinion matters a lot, but for what it's worth, I read these arguments and I just don't find them very persuasive. Secondly, and more importantly, it's my observation that, to the best of my knowledge, no scientist with credentials in the relevant sciences, we're talking about astronomy, physics, geology especially, has ever become a young earth believer on the basis of the scientific evidence. Now, be sure you hear me carefully. There are young earth scientists with good credentials, with academic degrees, PhDs in geology, who are young earthers. But as far as I can tell, they always come into that position by way of the theological argument. Someone persuades them that the Bible has to be read as saying that the earth is very young. You have to read the days of creation as literal days. You have to read all of Genesis 1 as pure historical narrative. There's no possibility that we're dealing here with a piece of literature that would have been understood very differently by its original hearers, that maybe is not asking the questions that we're asking about nature. No, this piece of literature, Genesis 1, is straightforward historical narrative. It's telling us that God created the world in 6 literal 24-hour days, therefore the earth must be young. You come into young earth creationism by that argument, and then if you have scientific interests and credentials, you may use those to try to prove your point. But as far as I personally know, nobody with the scientific credentials comes to young earth creationism on the basis of the scientific data. On the contrary, I think what happens is that they wind up believing that the earth is young despite the evidence and not because of the evidence. And I think that's very troubling. My third reason for thinking that young earth science cannot win the day is that I believe that the hurdle that has to be jumped is just way too high. Think about all the evidence we've talked about. We've talked about ice cores, we've talked about sediments, we've talked about igneous rock and sedimentary rock and metamorphic rock, we've talked about radiometric decay, we've talked about pressure waves on the sun, we've talked about the absence of a lot of nuclides that you would expect to be here if the earth were young. We've talked about starlight, we've talked about various means that are used to estimate the age of the galaxy and the universe. The young earth scientists, to make their case, are going to have to answer each one of these points. It's not enough simply to come up with a few suggestions. Maybe during the year of Noah's flood, light traveled faster than it does now. Well, show us the evidence. Where is the empirical evidence that light used to travel faster than it does now? And you not only need to show the empirical evidence, you then need to completely revise Einstein's equations and the entire understanding of the structure of the universe that belongs to modern physics. To do this, to answer all of this data that indicate that the universe is old, the young earth scientists are going to have to effect not one, but many scientific revolutions, each one of them as big as any scientific revolution that has occurred to this point. I don't think they can do it. I think I've probably got a better chance of winning the lottery, and I don't buy lottery tickets. I just don't think it can be done. Now, if you are in young earth circles, maybe you're in a young earth homeschool group, or you're in a young earth Christian school, or in a church that teaches young earth theology, you may not realize how desperate the situation is. And the reason for that is simply this. There's kind of a circularity of reasoning that goes on. This takes place in all communities. It's not just Christian communities, and it's not just on this one point. And there's nothing, I'm not suggesting anything, that anybody's got bad intentions here, but here's how it works. You have theologians, pastors, who may not have a whole lot of scientific training, who look at the Bible, and it sure seems to them like it says that the earth is young. And because the Bible is the authority, they say, well, that's the truth. I'm going to take my stand on it. They mean well. In their congregations, there are people with scientific interest who believe that. They are convinced of it. They go out then and they try to come up with suggestions as to how maybe the physical data can be understood in such a way as to be compatible with young Earth creationism. They come back with their suggestions. You know, suggestions like the ones I've talked about. Maybe radiometric decay is not really as steady as people think it is, or maybe once the speed of light was different from it is now. These are suggestions. These are not really theories. They are certainly not anything that's proven. But then what happens is that the same leaders who first began the circle of thought by saying the Bible requires us to believe this, seize upon these suggestions as if they were established fact. And so you find yourself sometimes in young Earth circles with people acting as if it's only the sheer stubbornness and sinfulness or even stupidity of scientists that keeps them from seeing that the universe is young. Well, I think that's just plain inaccurate. I think the reality is that the physical evidence is overwhelming that the universe is old. And I think that we need to understand that. Well, is there any other way young Earth proponents can make their case? There is one other way. And that is by arguing that God created the world to look older than it is, that he created the world with the appearance of age, or as people sometimes like to say, he created a mature world. We'll talk about that next time. Thanks very much for watching.